On the morning of 16th October 1946, Field Marshal Wilhelm Keitel mounted the gallows at Nuremberg with a military bearing. He had been the highest-ranking German officer to face trial before the International Military Tribunal, found guilty on all counts: crimes against humanity, crimes against peace, war crimes, and conspiracy. His last words echoed through the execution chamber: "I call on God Almighty to have mercy on the German people." More than 2 million German soldiers went to their death for the fatherland before me. I follow now my sons, all for Germany. The trapdoor opened. His death marked the end of an era. But for his wife Lessa and their surviving children, the ordeal was only beginning. From the corridors of the Wehrmacht High Command to the uncertainty of post-war Germany, the Keitel name would carry a weight that could never be lifted. Wilhelm Keitel had married Lisa Fontaine on 18th April 1909. She was the daughter of a wealthy landowner and brewer from Wilfel near Hanover, a match that brought both social standing and financial security to the young artillery officer. The marriage produced 6 children, though one died in infancy. The 5 who survived into adulthood were Nona, born in January 1911, Erika, born a few years later, Karl-Heinz, born on 2nd January 1914, Ernst-Wilhelm, born in 1915, and Hans-Georg, born in June 1919. Lisa was described by those who knew the family as the stronger and more ambitious partner in the marriage. Walter Görlitz, who edited Keitel's memoirs after the war, noted that she was probably the stronger and certainly the more ambitious partner of the marriage, while Wilhelm was just an average officer, whose only secret ambition was to be a farmer. Indeed, when Keitel's father died in 1934, leaving behind the family estate at Helmscherode, Wilhelm had considered retiring from military service to become a farmer at last. Instead, he was offered command of the 22nd Infantry Division at Bremen, and his path toward the highest echelons of Nazi power continued. Family letters from 1933 revealed Lisa's enthusiasm for Hitler after Wilhelm had met with him. She wrote that her husband had spoken at length with Hitler and has been up to his cottage, and was full of enthusiasm about him. His eyes were fabulous, and how the man could speak! This early enchantment with the Nazi leader would prove fateful for the entire family. Throughout the 1930s and the war years, the Keitels lived comfortably, enjoying the privileges that came with Wilhelm's position as Chief of the Supreme Command of the Armed Forces. Their status afforded them access to the inner circles of the regime, protection from the hardships ordinary Germans faced, and a standard of living that insulated them from the consequences of the policies Wilhelm helped implement. By the spring of 1945, that world was collapsing. As Allied forces closed in on Germany from all directions, the Keitel family faced the disintegration of everything they had known. Wilhelm remained at his post until the very end, calling for counterattacks during the Battle of Berlin that were impossible to execute. After Hitler's suicide on 30 April 1945, Keitel stayed on as a member of the short-lived Flensburg government under Grand Admiral Karl Dönitz. On 7 May 1945, Alfred Jodl signed Germany's unconditional surrender at Reims, but Stalin demanded a second signing. The following night, in the Berlin suburb of Karlshorst, it was Wilhelm Keitel who signed the German instrument of surrender before Soviet Marshal Georgy Zhukov. The act that formally ended the war in Europe also sealed his fate. 5 days later, on 30th of May 1945, Keitel was arrested along with the rest of the Flensburg government. He was interned at Camp Ashcan in Mondorf-les-Bains, Luxembourg, a facility created specifically to hold high-ranking Nazi officials before their trials. During his preliminary interrogation in August 1945, Keitel described himself with remarkable candor. "At the bottom of my heart, I was a loyal shield-bearer for Adolf Hitler." For Lisa and the surviving children, the arrest meant immediate uncertainty. Their property was subject to seizure, their bank accounts frozen, and their future dependent on forces entirely beyond their control. The Nuremberg trials opened in November 1945 with Keitel as one of the most prominent defendants. He sat in the dock alongside Hermann Göring, Rudolf Hess, Joachim von Ribbentrop, and other architects of the Nazi regime. Prosecutors indicted him on all 4 counts: conspiracy to commit crimes against peace, planning and waging wars of aggression, war crimes, and crimes against humanity. The evidence against him was overwhelming, documented in his own signature on order after order that had led to the deaths of millions. He had signed the infamous Commissar Order of June 1941, which mandated the immediate execution of Soviet political officers upon capture, a directive that resulted in the murder of tens of thousands of prisoners of war in direct violation of international law. He had signed the Night and Fog Decree of December 1941, under which resistance fighters and political prisoners in Western Europe were secretly transported to Germany, where they vanished without trace. Families never learned what happened to their loved ones. The decree was designed precisely to maximize terror through uncertainty. He had signed orders authorizing collective punishment and reprisals that demanded the execution of 50 to 100 civilians for every German soldier killed by partisans. When German military lawyers had argued in 1941 that Soviet prisoners of war should be treated in accordance with the Geneva Conventions, Keitel had dismissed them with chilling words. These doubts correspond to military ideas about wars of chivalry. Our job is to suppress a way of life. During his testimony in April 1946, Keitel attempted to shield himself behind the defense of superior orders, claiming he had merely carried out Hitler's commands. The tribunal rejected this argument entirely, establishing a principle that would reshape international law. Following orders is no defense when those orders are manifestly criminal. Keitel tried to portray himself as a soldier who had been exploited, a professional military man caught up in forces beyond his control. But the evidence told a different story of a man who had willingly served as Hitler's instrument, who had signed criminal orders knowing their nature, and who had never seriously attempted to resist. Throughout the trial, Keitel admitted his guilt on certain charges while attempting to minimize his agency. He confessed that the deployment of forced labor was the worst of the atrocities committed during the war. When German military lawyers had argued in 1941 that Soviet prisoners of war should be treated in accordance with the Geneva Conventions, Keitel had dismissed them. These doubts correspond to military ideas about wars of chivalry. Our job is to suppress a way of life. Over 3 million Soviet prisoners died in German captivity. At the end of the trial, Keitel made a final plea. He wished to be executed by firing squad and die a soldier's death. The Allied Control Council denied his request. Death by hanging, they ruled, would underscore the criminal rather than military nature of his acts. The execution took place in the early hours of 16th of October 1946 in a small gymnasium within Nuremberg prison, a room approximately 33 feet wide by 80 feet long with cracked plaster walls. 3 black-painted wooden scaffolds stood inside. Kingsbury Smith, the American journalist chosen by lot to represent the press, described the scene in vivid detail. Keitel entered the chamber just 2 minutes after Joachim von Ribbentrop had dropped through the trap, while Ribbentrop's body still swung at the end of its rope, concealed behind black canvas curtains. Keitel did not appear as tense as von Ribbentrop had been. He held his head high while his hands were being tied and walked erect toward the gallows with military bearing. When asked his name, he responded loudly, his voice clear and firm. He mounted the scaffold as though stepping onto a reviewing stand to take a salute from German armies. On the platform, the prison chaplain Henry F. Gerekel stood with him. Earlier that day, Keitel had told Gerekel, "You have helped me more than you know. May Christ, my Saviour, stand by me all the way. I shall need him so much." He received communion before being led to his death. Now, facing the witnesses gathered below, he spoke his final words. Witnesses agreed that he showed more courage on the gallows than he had in the courtroom, where he had attempted to shift responsibility onto Hitler's ghost. The trapdoor was small, and as Keitel's body dropped, his head struck its edge with a sickening impact. His neck did not break cleanly. According to reports, he convulsed for 24 minutes. Before death finally came, his body swinging and twisting within the curtained enclosure. It was a slow and agonizing death, far from the quick military execution he had requested. His body, along with those of the other executed men, von Ribbentrop, Julius Streicher, Wilhelm Frick, Alfred Rosenberg, Hans Frank, Fritz Saukel, Ernst Kaltenbrunner, Arthur Seyss-Inquart and Alfred Jodl, was loaded into army trucks and driven to Ostfriedhof Cemetery in Munich. There, in the same crematorium that had served the Dachau concentration camp, the bodies were reduced to ashes. That night, under cover of darkness, American officials drove to the Reichenbachbrücke, a bridge over the Isar River. The ashes were scattered into the Wensbach, a small stream that flows into the Isar, deliberately ensuring that no grave could become a shrine for future generations of Nazi sympathizers. For the Keitel family, there would be no grave to visit. Yet according to some accounts, veterans later claimed that family members had purchased the ashes from American officials and buried them in the family plot at Bad Gandersheim, the Keitels' ancestral seat in Lower Saxony. Whether this story is true remains uncertain. What is certain is that a grave of honor exists in Bad Gandersheim, alongside the resting places of Wilhelm's brother Bodewin and other family members. Another family grave at Ohlsdorf Cemetery in Hamburg has become what some locals describe as a neo-Nazi attraction, with headstones repeatedly damaged over the decades. Lisa Keitel survived her husband by more than a decade. After Wilhelm's execution, she faced the denazification process that all Germans with significant connections to the regime were required to undergo. The details of her tribunal proceedings are less documented than those of other Nazi wives, but her circumstances were challenging. With her husband executed as a war criminal, she had no pension rights, no property claims, and little security. She settled quietly in northern Germany, attempting to rebuild some semblance of normal life. Lisa Fontaine Keitel died on 14th October 1959 in Timmendorfer Strand, Schleswig-Holstein. She was 72 years old. Her death came 13 years after she watched her husband led to the gallows at Nuremberg. The Keitel children's fates varied dramatically, shaped by the war itself as much as by its aftermath. The youngest son, Hans-Georg, never lived to see his father's downfall. Born in 1919, he had followed the family tradition of military service. During the 1940 campaign in France, Hans-Georg was severely wounded in the thigh. He recovered and was assigned to the Motorized Artillery Regiment 29. On 17th July 1941, less than a month after the invasion of the Soviet Union began, a Soviet aircraft attack mortally wounded him. He died the following day in a field hospital. Hans-Georg was buried in the family plot at Bad Gandersheim. He was 22 years old. His father, then at the height of his power as chief of the OKW, learned of the death while directing operations from Hitler's headquarters. When Wilhelm Keitel stood on the gallows 5 years later, his reference to following "my sons" acknowledged this loss. The eldest son, Karl-Heinz Keitel, survived the war but carried his own complex legacy. Born on 2nd January 1914 in Wolfenbüttel, he had joined the army in 1934 and served in various cavalry units. In May 1938, in a marriage that was as much political calculation as personal choice, Karl-Heinz married Dorothea von Blomberg, the daughter of Field Marshal Werner von Blomberg. His father Wilhelm made no attempt to hide that the engagement was designed to strengthen his relationship with his superior. The marriage produced 4 children, a son named Hans Christoph, born in July 1939, and 3 daughters, Sibylla, Jutta, and Stephanie, born between 1940 and 1943. Karl-Heinz's military career took a controversial turn in August 1944 when he transferred from the regular army into the Waffen-SS. The timing is significant. This was just weeks after the failed assassination attempt against Hitler on 20th July 1944. Some historians suggest that the Keitel family's transfer of allegiance to the SS may have been intended to demonstrate loyalty in the aftermath of the plot. Karl-Heinz was assigned to the 22nd SS Volunteer Cavalry Division, Maria Theresia, and given command of SS Freiwilligen Cavalry Regiment 17 in Hungary. In November 1944, his division was assigned to the defense of Budapest as Soviet forces encircled the city. The Siege of Budapest was one of the most brutal urban battles of the war. For 50 days, from late December 1944 to mid-February 1945, German and Hungarian forces held out against overwhelming Soviet numbers. The defenders were encircled on 26 December 1944, and what followed was a nightmare of urban combat, starvation, and atrocity. Approximately 38,000 civilians died during the siege, about 13,000 from military action, and 25,000 from starvation, disease, and other causes. Members of the fascist Arrow Cross Party conducted mass executions of Jews along the banks of the Danube, shooting victims and letting their bodies fall into the river. Karl Heinz's cavalry regiment fought in this inferno. On 12th of December 1944, before the encirclement was complete, he was wounded in action while defending against Red Army probing attacks. He was awarded the Wound Badge in black for his injuries. In February 1945, while still in the besieged city, he received the German Cross in gold, a high decoration for combat leadership. At some point during the final desperate weeks of the siege, Karl Heinz was evacuated from Budapest by air. One of only about 170 men from his division, the middle son, Ernst-Wilhelm Keitel, endured perhaps the most harrowing post-war experience of any family member. Born in 1915, he had followed his father and brothers into military service, rising to the rank of major in the German army. Unlike Karl Heinz, who served in cavalry units and later the Waffen-SS, Ernst-Wilhelm served in staff positions, his career shaped by the practical realities of a war that consumed millions. During the final chaotic months of the conflict, Ernst-Wilhelm found himself trapped in the Courland Pocket, the isolated German position on the Baltic coast of Latvia, where Army Group Courland held out long after the rest of the Eastern Front had collapsed. The Courland Pocket was a strange anomaly of the war's endgame. Cut off from the rest of Germany since October 1944, approximately 200,000 German troops held a small perimeter against repeated Soviet offensives. Hitler refused to authorize evacuation by sea, insisting that the pocket tied down Soviet forces that might otherwise be used against Berlin. When Germany finally surrendered on 8 May 1945, the troops in Courland laid down their arms and marched into Soviet captivity. Ernst-Wilhelm was among them. For years, his family had no idea whether he was alive or dead. The Soviet Union provided little information about the millions of German prisoners it held, and the fate of individual soldiers often remained unknown for years, sometimes forever. During his father's trial and execution, during his mother's struggles in post-war Germany, during his brother's quiet reintegration into West German society, Ernst-Wilhelm remained missing. A ghost, neither confirmed dead nor known to be alive. The uncertainty must have been agonizing for a family already dealing with the public shame of Wilhelm Keitel's conviction and execution. It was not until 1954, 8 years after the war's end, 8 years after his father had mounted the gallows, that the family received the first indication that Ernst-Wilhelm had survived. The conditions of his captivity had been brutal beyond imagination. According to some accounts, he was tortured during interrogation, likely targeted because of his father's position. The Soviets had special interest in the families of high-ranking Nazi officials, seeking information and sometimes simply exacting revenge. Ernst-Wilhelm suffered such severe injuries that both of his legs had to be amputated. Wilhelm Keitel went to his grave never knowing that his son was still alive, never knowing the price Ernst-Wilhelm would pay for bearing the Keitel name. Ernst-Wilhelm finally returned to Germany on 15th of January 1956, among the last transport of 450 German prisoners of war released from Soviet captivity. By this point, most German POWs had been released years earlier. Those held until the mid-1950s were typically either convicted of specific crimes or, like Ernst-Wilhelm, connected to prominent Nazi figures. He had spent over a decade in Soviet camps, 11 years in conditions designed to break both body and spirit. The journey home must have been surreal, returning to a country that had been utterly transformed, to a family that had learned to live without him, to a society that was rapidly moving beyond the war even as he emerged from its worst consequences. The reasons for his extended detention were almost certainly connected to his father's position, though Soviet records remain largely inaccessible even today. The Soviets held prisoners for various purposes, as bargaining chips in Cold War negotiations, as labor for reconstruction projects, as subjects for interrogation about military and political matters. Ernst-Wilhelm, as the son of Hitler's military chief of staff, likely endured all of these. By the time he was released, he was a broken man, crippled, aged beyond his years, carrying memories that could never be shared. After his release, Ernst-Wilhelm settled in Bad Pyrmont, a spa town in Lower Saxony known for its healing waters and quiet atmosphere. He lived there quietly, avoiding public attention, building whatever life was possible for a man who had lost so much. According to a researcher who contacted his household in the 1980s, Ernst-Wilhelm used letterhead bearing his name and occasionally corresponded with historians and collectors, but he consistently declined requests to participate in publications about the war. In one such letter, dated January 1985, he refused permission for his photograph to be used in a collection, noting that he was not a Knight's Cross holder and had no interest in such attention. His signature, the researcher noted, was remarkably similar to his father's. His widow, contacted years after his death, was described as bitter and unwilling to discuss her husband or his family. She reportedly received numerous inquiries over the years from historians, from journalists, from people curious about what it meant to be the son of Wilhelm Keitel, and had long since tired of them all. Ernst-Wilhelm Keitel died around 1997, having spent the second half of his life carrying a name that connected him irrevocably to one of history's most condemned figures. He was approximately 82 years old, having survived his father by more than 50 years, having outlived almost everyone who remembered the world before the war. Whatever he thought about his father's legacy, whatever he felt about his own suffering, he took those thoughts to the grave. The Keitel daughters Nona and Erika left fewer traces in the historical record. This was not unusual for women of their generation and background. Daughters of Nazi officials often married, changed their names and disappeared into the anonymity of post-war German society. Nona Keitel, born in January 1911, was described as a tall woman who studied at Trinity College Dublin in the mid-1930s, part of a cohort of wealthy Germans who attended the prestigious Irish University as exchange students. She later married and took the surname Illing. Erika, born in the mid-1910s, similarly faded from public documentation after the war. Neither daughter appears to have sought public attention or spoken about their father's legacy. Wilhelm Keitel's brother, General der Infanterie Bodewin Keitel, also navigated the post-war period with considerably less notoriety than his older sibling. Bodewin had served as chief of the Army Personnel Office and later commanded the XX Army Corps. On the day of the 20th of July 1944 assassination attempt, Bodewin was on an inspection tour in Danzig when his command post received a telex from the conspirators at the Bendler block. His first officer, Hasso von Böhmer, had been recruited by the resistance. When Bodewin learned of the failed attempt and confirmed by telephone with his brother Wilhelm that Hitler was alive, he immediately had Böhmer arrested. Böhmer was executed on 4 March 1945 in Plötzensee prison. After the war, Bodewin was captured by Allied forces and held until 1947. Unlike his brother, he faced no war crimes charges and was released to resume civilian life. He died on 27 July 1953 in Göttingen and was buried in the family plot at Bad Gandersheim, where subsequent generations would place a memorial for his brother Wilhelm. The question of how the Keitel family confronted or avoided confronting their patriarch's legacy remains largely unanswered. Unlike some families of Nazi leaders, the Keitels did not produce public figures who either defended or condemned Wilhelm's actions. There were no memoirs published by his children, no interviews given to documentarians, no participation in the growing field of what Germans call Vergangenheitsbewältigung, the process of coming to terms with the past. When researchers attempted to contact family members in later decades, they encountered reluctance and bitterness rather than engagement. Some descendants reportedly changed their surnames after emigrating to the United States and Australia, adopting variations such as Keitel to distance themselves from the association with the executed war criminal. This practice was not uncommon among families of prominent Nazis. The name itself carried such weight that bearing it openly meant constant confrontation with history's judgment. One curious connection links the Keitel family to an unlikely figure, J. Robert Oppenheimer, the physicist who led the Manhattan Project. Wilhelm Keitel was the uncle of Catherine Kitty Oppenheimer, Robert's wife. Kitty's mother, Katta Wissering, had been briefly engaged in her youth to a cousin, Wilhelm Keitel himself. The engagement was broken, the families diverged, and decades later, one branch helped create the atomic bomb, while the other stood at the center of the regime against which that bomb was developed. History's ironies rarely arrange themselves so neatly. Wilhelm Keitel wrote his memoirs during the 6 weeks before his execution. They were later published under various titles, including In the Service of the Reich and The Memoirs of Field Marshal Keitel, edited by Walter Görlitz. In these pages, Keitel reflected on his career with a mixture of self-justification and regret. "It is tragic to have to realize," he wrote, that the best I had to give as a soldier, obedience and loyalty, was exploited for purposes which could not be recognized at the time, and that I did not see that there is a limit set even for a soldier's performance of his duty. These words have been debated by historians ever since. Were they genuine insight or final evasion? Keitel's reputation among his fellow officers had been captured in the nickname they gave him, Laketel, a play on the German word Lackey, meaning lackey. Even those who served beside him regarded him as Hitler's willing tool. The Keitel family graves at Bad Gandersheim tell a story of their own. Hans Georg, the son killed in 1941, rests there. Bodewin, the brother who survived, was buried there in 1953. And somewhere, if the veterans' accounts are true, ashes that may be Wilhelm's were secretly interred in the family plot, purchased from American officials who had scattered them into a Munich stream. The graves have reportedly been vandalized over the years, attracting both those who wish to honor a war criminal and those who wish to desecrate his memory. In Hamburg's Ohlsdorf Cemetery, where another family plot exists, locals describe it as a site that draws neo-Nazi visitors, leading to repeated damage. The grandchildren of Wilhelm Keitel have remained entirely out of public view. Karl-Heinz's 4 children, Hans Christoph, Sibylla, Jutta and Stephanie, carry both the Keitel name and, through their mother Dorothea, the Blomberg name. Whether they chose to engage with their grandfather's legacies, whether they changed their names, whether they emigrated or remained in Germany, these details have not entered the public record. In an age when many descendants of Nazi leaders have spoken publicly about inherited guilt and the burden of history, the Keitel descendants' silence is itself a kind of statement. The story of the Keitel family after World War II reflects broader patterns in German society's struggle with its past. In the immediate post-war years, many families of Nazi officials focused simply on survival, finding food, shelter and employment in a devastated country. The questions of moral responsibility were often deferred in favour of practical necessities. As the decades passed, a younger generation began to demand reckoning, but by then, many of the direct connections had been severed. Children had grown up and moved away. Names had been changed. Stories had been buried. Wilhelm Keitel embodied a particular type of complicity. The career military officer who served the Nazi regime without holding ideological conviction as his primary motivation, yet who signed orders that led to the deaths of millions. His defense at Nuremberg, that he was merely following orders, was rejected not only by the tribunal but by the subsequent development of international law. The principle established at Nuremberg was clear: following orders is no defense when those orders are manifestly criminal. This principle, more than any personal legacy, is what the name Keitel evokes today. Lisa Keitel died in obscurity. Karl-Heinz died having served in the SS and later sold his father's papers. Ernst-Wilhelm died after spending 11 years in Soviet captivity, bearing scars both physical and psychological that were never publicly discussed. The daughters disappeared into married names and private lives. The grandchildren and great-grandchildren carry their inheritance in silence. Unlike the Himmlers, who produced both Gudrun Berwitz's defiant defense of her father and Katrin Himmler's scholarly confrontation with family history, the Keitels have offered no public account of how they understand what Wilhelm Keitel did and what it means to be descended from him. Perhaps this silence is its own form of verdict. Wilhelm Keitel's last words invoke Germany and his sons. His sons, one dead in combat, one scarred by a decade in Soviet camps, one who served in the SS, represented the cost of his choices as much as their continuation. The family he left behind navigated a world that would never forget who he was, yet they did so by ensuring that almost nothing of their own stories would be remembered. In the end, the Keitel family's response to their inheritance was to let history record Wilhelm's crimes and judgments, while leaving their own experiences unwritten. They lived, they died, and the name they carried remained what it had become on that morning in October 1946, a synonym for the complicity of those who serve criminal regimes while claiming merely to follow orders. If you found this video insightful, watch What Happened to Hermann Göring's Family After WW2 next. Like this video, subscribe and hit the bell for more historic weirdos. Thanks for watching.